Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of the Cutting Room Floor. This is where I look back on something that we touched on in a recent message here at Sunny Slope, and we dig a little deeper into it. We go down something of a rabbit trail and explore what it might mean. A couple days ago, we looked at a text in Ephesians chapter 2 where Paul talks about how the gospel tears down this dividing wall between Jew and Gentile, and that got me thinking a little bit more about what this dividing wall was all about, and what the temple was all about. And so I want to show you a couple things today. I'm going to just pull it up on my screen here, and see if we can't do this. So you should be looking at a picture of really two temples. Now, when we talk about in the Bible, we talk a lot about, there being the temple, but actually over the course of the whole Bible, there were really three temples that were built and destroyed at different times. So the first one, and probably the most well-known one, of the one we often think about, is the temple that Solomon built in the Old Testament. Now, you can see right here, you can see what that might have looked like from above, just in terms of its size. But more importantly, so Solomon's temple was built during the time of Solomon, and after the Israelites went into exile, that temple was actually completely destroyed. And then you'll remember after that, you might remember the book of Ezra, Nehemiah. The people actually come back from exile and they rebuild the temple, and it was not nearly as great or as glorious as it once had been. And so it was sort of this bittersweet moment in which many of the people who could remember the glory days of Solomon's temple, they looked at this new temple and they were grieved because it was so much smaller and it was so much less impressive. Now, that happens around 400 or so BC, maybe a little bit before that. And so we don't have a whole lot of at least biblical record of that temple and what took place there. But the next important thing is where you see here, and it's called Herod's temple. Now, this is interesting because Herod, of course, was not a Jewish person, but he rebuilt the temple as something of a way to curry favor with the Jewish people. Now, here's what's important. You'll notice that size-wise, Herod's temple is enormous, even compared to Solomon's temple. But you'll also notice that Herod's temple has a couple of features that Solomon's temple never had. And one of those, of course, is the women's courtyard. Now, that tells you that over time, there was a transition in Jewish thinking that seems to have taken place, and that is to make distinctions between male and female, men and women, and to actually limit access to the women. Now, the reason I bring that up is because you don't see that distinction in Solomon's temple. That's another way of saying that these divisions within the temple were not God's idea. They were not God's desire to separate men and women, and, as I'm going to touch on in a minute, Jew and Gentile. Those ideas were added in later. They were brought in later on. Now, if we go to the next slide, this is another picture. It's a recreation of what the temple might have looked like, and you can see it's a very elaborate temple. If you look up here where my mouse is, right there, that's where the sacrifices would have taken place. That's where the Holy of Holies would have been. And then you go a little bit on the outside, and you have the inner courts, and you have these various gates and entrance points. What is relevant for our purpose here is this. This is the court of the Gentiles. That too is something that was not inherent to the original design and purpose of the Jewish temple. When God commanded the Israelites to build the temple, he did not command them to create all these barriers between Jew and Gentile, men and women. That was something that was added later on. But you can tell in this picture of the temple that it played a fairly prominent place. I'm going to put up another picture here. This is maybe another angle, and the court of the Gentiles would be right here in the foreground, right where my cursor is. And then if you were a Gentile, you could have access to that part of the temple. But you could, unless you were a Jewish person, you could not go in. Now you can see here, there's this little raised platform. So in other words, if you were a Jewish person, you'd actually have to go up. You'd leave the court of the Gentiles by climbing a set of stairs and then going in through this door here. In this outer court, this is the court of women. And that's where both Jewish males and their wives could go, provided the wives were not on their monthly period, which would actually disqualify them from entering in because they would have been deemed ritually unclean or impure. Quick little word about that. When we hear unclean or impure, we tend to interpret that in moral terms, but biblically, that was not the case. To have something unclean did not necessarily mean it was immoral. It just meant that it was ritually impure. And we could go into that a whole lot more, but we're not going to. I just wanted to point out that pure and impure were not moral designations. They were just descriptions of a person's appropriateness and fitness to draw near to the presence of God based on a number of factors. Anyway, so you have the court of women here. Jewish males and their wives could go in there, but they could, women could only remain in this court here. Now, there's another gate here, and you can see that leads into this outer court, which would have been called the court of Israel. And that court would have been reserved for the Jewish males. So Jewish men could have had access into that part of the temple, but they could still not have gone any further. You can see there's yet a final gate here. And by the way, you can see each time you go in, it's a series of rising steps. So once you're outside of the temple, you go up here, and then you're in the court of the Gentiles. Then you go up further until you get into here. And it appears there's another stairway or some sort of elevated place there. And then you finally climb up again here to go into this to the temple itself. Now, to get into this inner part of the temple, of course, it would not be enough for you to be a Jewish male to go in there. You would have to be a priest, and you would have to be wearing your priestly vestments, and you'd have to perform a very rigorous series of purification exercises. You had to wash, and you had to bathe, and you had to wash your garments and change your garments, and so on and so forth. My point in all of this is that is a couple of things. First of all, note that the distinction between men and women, Jew and Gentile, was foreign to the temple itself. That was not God's design. He did create designations between pure and impure, and priest and layperson, and there were reasons for that, but the designations for Jew and Gentile were not part of the original temple design. That was added in later Judaism, intertestamental Judaism, and the wall then, which would have been here, that's what I did reference on Sunday. There would have been an inscription on that wall that would have said, "No Gentile may enter here on pain of death." And so to enter in there would have resulted in a Jewish person. Jewish people could actually, under Roman law, Jewish people were actually allowed to put to death Gentiles for religious offenses. And so that was a possibility. But again, all of this was extra. This was not part of God's design for the temple. In fact, when Jesus cleanses the temple, there's that very famous story in which he goes in and overturns the tables and the animals and so on, and the money. That would have taken place here in this court of the Gentiles, because what had happened was the Jewish people had turned the temple into a place that was restricted to the nations. Nations were not allowed access to it, and the only place they could get to was a place that had been then turned into to a marketplace. And so that had completely distorted the whole purpose of the temple. God's design and his ultimate intent for the temple was that it be exactly the opposite, that it be a place that draw the nations in for the purpose of worship. And so the temple had a missional aspect to it. And of course, this is, ultimately what the gospel is all about, is Jesus coming in and tearing down these walls, not literally, of course, but by fulfilling the obligations of the law, he creates a way that everyone can get in. Now, again, it's significant that each of these levels is one higher than the other, because it does create an actual hierarchy. And so what the gospel does is, it, as I said on Sunday, it levels the ground. It actually says that the only way into the Holy of Holies, the only way into this most sacred place is not by measuring up or being the right, being a male and a Jewish male and a priest. It's actually through Jesus. Jesus is the only one who is worthy of access into this temple, and it's on his basis and on his merit that a person then can get in. So that's when Paul talks about Jesus tearing down the walls. That's exactly what he's getting at. He's saying that Jesus is the one who opens the access and opens the way for us to get into the temple. So that's a little more background on what the temple is all about. Thanks for watching. As always, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and check back for other videos, and we will see you next time.